Okay, cool. So you all know what you've joined then. We're going to go through a little secondary port problem. Imagining that we're heading off to anchor up. We're going to anchor up overnight. We've got a couple of things to work out, or various things to work out. One, how much chain we're going to need ultimately. So we need to know the max depth of water. We'll also want to know what sort of depth we want to anchor in to make sure we're still floating come the next low water, but we're floating in relatively low depth of water so that we can tuck ourselves into a nice shallow bit. Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to share screen and I'll bring up the question that we were looking at. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Up on your screen, you can. Good. Okay. So this was the problem we were looking at. So we were going to head to this well-known beauty spot of Roswell Cove on August the 21st at 2012, rather exactly, in the evening. We had a little weather forecast that we can see there. So we've got a wind of north-northwest 3, sometimes 4. Weather's set there, i.e. no significant precipitation, decent viz. And the boat that we're in is a generic sailing boat. We've got 1.7 meter draft and an air draft of 16 meters. Can anybody tell me what air draft means? Are you all happy with what that means? Or could somebody tell me?
Mast height.
Yeah, from
the waterline.
From the waterline. Perfect. Good stuff. Okay. Good. So there's our little generic boat, and we're heading into Roswell Cove and hoping to anchor up. I'm going to ask you guys some questions. I know there's quite a few of you, so if it becomes a bit of a bun fight, we might have to do it by chat and actually type it out. In the meantime, I'll try it audio-wise. So first question we come to then. So what factors should she consider? You can see I've gone a little bit woke, and we have a female skipper for this. So what factors should she consider when choosing her anchorage in the first place? So what kind of things do we need to think about first up? Anybody?
Shelter.
Yeah, so we want to be sheltered from wind and tide, of course. So we want to make sure that we've got shelter from wind and tide, not only now, but possibly later. If we're staying overnight, we need to make sure that we're going to be okay if there's any kind of wind shift, don't we? So we'd certainly get that out. Anything else anybody can think of?
Date of the tide when you anchor.
Sorry, Janet, say again.
Date of the tide when you anchor.
Yeah, so we certainly will be there for a change of tide, if not 2, won't we? So that'll be something we need to think about. Is that going to be okay in various directions? So is it going to be okay in terms of resetting the anchor on the change of the tide? That'll be one, won't it? And also make sure that our swinging room's sufficient that we can lie exactly in the opposite direction come the change of the tide. Good. Anything else?
A good surface to put the anchor down on.
Yeah, good. Was that Gareth? Who was that?
Not me.
Sorry, Howard, was it? Apologies. Yeah, perfect. So nature of the seabed, that's important, isn't it? So Howard, what sort of things would we be happy with and what would we be less happy with?
Well, we don't want rocks.
No.
We want something that'll hold the anchor with it. Might be good mud, might be sand.
Yeah, mud and sand we'd be happy with, wouldn't we? Weed certainly not, and rocks preferably not either. Good. So nature of the seabed would be checking. Thinking about the swinging room, is there a disadvantage to anchoring up next to a motorboat if we're a sailing boat, or would that be okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
No problem.
What would be wrong with that, Richard?
Because these would swing a different way because of the draft.
Yeah, so a sailing boat's got a lot of profile under the water, hasn't it? And not a particular large windage, unless the sails are up, of course. Whereas a motorboat, exactly the opposite. So we talk about a sailing boat being windrowed, more affected by the, tide road, more affected by the tide, and a motorboat being windrowed, so more affected by the wind. Good, so we'll be thinking about all these things, and then we'll be going into Roswell Cove and picking a spot based on that. So I'm just going to bring up our little anchor spot. And there it is. So based on pretty much our weather forecast rather than things we just talked about, because there's not much to pick between these two particular anchorages other than the weather forecast. Which one of these would you favour? The one further north or the one farther south? Any of you?
Further north.
Yeah,
Further north.
perfect, because
The wind.
Yeah, very straightforward.
Northwest.
We're more in the lee of the land there if we're in the one up north, aren't we? So we're being blown away from the shore, whereas there'll be a small amount of fetch down further on. So yeah, we'd pick the one up north, tuck ourselves in there. Perfect. Okay. So when we're looking to do a secondary port calculation for Rosal Cove, then, which is doesn't have its own set of tidal heights and times, would we use the curve for Port Fraser, which is its standard port? Can we fit in the standard port one and get our information sorted out, assuming we've done our extrapolations, stroke interpolations? Is that where we draw our curve?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Is that always the case, or or are there exceptions to that? So are there other places where we couldn't use the standard port? Anybody sailed in the Solent at all? I hope you have.
Yeah, I don't know this from experience, but I'm just doing the Yachtmaster theory course at the moment. I have this slightly vague memory of there being about 5 or 6 ports which don't have a standard port in the normal way.
Yeah, so in the Solent, pretty much every port is a secondary port, and all of those ports have their own secondary port tidal height curve, and I've pulled up a few there that you can see. You can see they're all low water curves because we have strange tides in the Solent, and there's a double high water stand. You can see up the top there. You can see what happens there as the tide comes in, starts to ebb a little bit, and then there's a secondary high water stand. So pinpointing the high water time is a little bit indistinct, whereas the low water is a nice pendulum swing. So it works exactly the same way. It's just we have a low water reference time, and we'll work it from there. So yeah, in normal circumstances, you typically think you can use the standard port curve for your secondary port calculations, but just be aware, particularly in the Solent, that it's not always the case. And in the Solent, you'd need to choose your little low water curve and base it on that. And there can be quite a difference, so important to know that. Good, okay. Right, so the skipper wants to fill out a tidal height curve so that she can work out what depth to anchor in at 2012 and how much chain to put out. Which times and heights of high water stroke low water will she need to be able to achieve this? So which of these do we need to pick out from the 21st or 21st and 22nd so that we can fill out our tidal height curve? Maybe Martin, I could get you to give me the answer to that, as I can see you on screen. So which ones are we going to need to fill out the curve and work out how much chain we're going to need?
The last two, 1701 and 2307.
Good. So
and the one of the next day as well comes into it later.
Perfect. Yeah. So our time reference, as you say, will be the 2307, won't it? That's for our high water tidal height curve. We're going to need the earlier low water, so we're straddling the time that we're looking at, which is 2012. And as you say, we need the next low water because we're staying overnight, and we're going to use that for working out what sort of fall of tide we're going to experience. And of course, in terms of working out the chain, we're going to be how much chain we need to put out. We're going to be looking at the max depth of water, which will be based on our high water, won't it? Good. Okay. We're going to go and do some secondary port calculations now. When do we stick the hour on? Because it is summertime, isn't it? Can we stick the hour on now before we go and do our calculations, or do we need to do it later?
Later.
We need to do it later. Good. So this little table that I brought up here is our secondary port calculation table. This is always, in all cases, printed in the standard time of the location at which it is. So where we are, that's UT, but it could be wherever it might be, French Standard Time, whatever it might be. So just to back up for a moment, those are the times that Martin gave us. So I put the times in brackets there. We don't need the low water time, do we? We only need one reference time, which is 2307, which is our high water, but we do need the low water height preceding our time, the high water height after that time, and the following low water the next day. Okay. All right, let's, I'm just going to change screen and see if I can do a little bit of drawing. I apologize in advance for my drawing because it's a little bit tricky with the mouse, but let's give it a go. Okay, so that's not what we want. Come back. In fact, let's get rid of that one. Okay, so we now need to work out, using our standard port information, what our bits of data are going to be for Rosal Cove. So I'm just going to draw out a little table. Let me just come back to our secondary port table there. Hold on. So let's do the high water one first of all. So Martin gave me 2307 UT as our time for high water at Port Fraser, our standard port. We can see that 2307 occurs between 1800 and midnight. Say again. Hello? Was that a question? No, okay. Background noise. Okay, so our 2307 occurs between 1800 and midnight. And what this table is telling us is that if our high water on any given day occurred at 1800, we would have to take off 18 minutes to get our information correct for Roswell Cove. If, on the other hand, it occurred at midnight, we'd have to take off 38 minutes. And if it occurs somewhere between the two, as ours does, we'll have to interpolate between the 18 minutes and the 38 minutes. So we'll go back to the little table I started drawing there on the whiteboard. And what I'm going to do is put those hours on the top. So we said we went from 1800 hours, whoops, that's supposed to be an 8, to midnight along the top. That's a spread of 6 hours, isn't it? So I'm going to very roughly draw out a little linear table with those hours in. So that would be 19, that would be 20, that would be 2100 hours, 22, and 2300 hours. And on the top, we said we went, on the bottom, sorry, we said we went from minus 18 minutes to minus 38 minutes. So that's a spread of 20 minutes. And I'm going to break the bottom half of my little graph down into 4 lots of 5, because that's quite easy bit of maths. So that would take me to minus 23 minutes, to minus, oops, to minus 28 minutes, and to minus 33 minutes along the bottom. And then we can look at our 2307 position, which would be roughly there, wouldn't it? And I reckon, doing that fairly roughly, that would come out at about minus 35 minutes. Does that look about right to you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that make any sense to anybody, or does it not make sense to anybody? Can everybody follow that, or does do we need further explanation on what I've done there?
Fine.
Aside from my terrible writing, of course. Okay, so we know we need to take off 35 minutes, sorry, off our 2307. So that would give us 2232 UT, and it's at this point we add our hour, which will give us 2332 DST. Okay.
Can you just do that again? Can you
I
just
can, yeah, of course. Let's come back to that. Sorry, let me change that screen then. So, in fact, I'll just go back to the little table. Who was asking that question? Was that?
It was Martin, me.
Martin, yes. So, Martin, so just to come back to the table for a moment, this is the table that we're looking at, and our high water time is 2307, isn't it, at our standard port? And we need to turn that into Roswell Cove. So we know that we're between 1800 hours and midnight.
Yes.
The difference on 1800 hours would be minus 18 minutes. On midnight, it would be minus 38 minutes. Okay, so we're somewhere between the two. And one way of working it out, and there are different ways, you could do it on a calculator, you could do it mathematically, but one way of working it out, if I come back to my whiteboard.
No, I've got the minus 35. I follow the minus 35.
Ah, okay, fine.
It was going from the time in the tide table to the
fine.
Is it plus or minus? That was, I think,
yeah. So if I wrote it down here, it was 2307 straight out the almanac, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was UT. Yeah. So we've worked out we need to take off 35 minutes from that, don't we? Yeah. Right. From my little table. So that gives me 2232.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed, UT. And it's at this point we now stick our hour on if we need to, which we do in this case. So that gives us our 2332 DST as our high water time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I got 2337, but I used a slightly different adjustment. So yeah.
Yes, well, I mean, we need to remember that we're sailing here in 4 or 5 minutes. You know, if that's critical to us, we're doing something wrong, aren't we? So this would be pretty close mathematically, I'd suggest. You know, if we did it on a calculator, I'd say that'd be pretty close. But, you know, a few minutes out, not a drama by any stretch of the imagination. And we can apply.
I do it arithmetically, and it came out at 35.
Did it? Ah, great. Who was that?
It's David. I can't
David,
do these liney things. They drive me mad.
Yes, no, I don't blame you. This is definitely one of the many things in sailing where you need to find your own particular way of skinning the cat. And yes. If the calculator is a better way for you, then perfect. So so mathematically, and according to David, it would be minus 35. But yeah, whoever had minus 37 or whatever was absolutely no problem at all. So we could apply this same approach to the heights also. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we'll just have a look at the high water height for starters. And what this is telling us then, working out our high water for Roswell Cove, is that if we went to Port Fraser and found out that our high water height was 4.2 at Port Fraser, we'd need to add 20 centimetres. If, on the other hand, it was 3.4, we'd need to take away 20 centimetres. And if it was somewhere in between those, we'd interpolate between here, or possibly it might be above 4.2 or below 3.4, in which case we'll extrapolate outside those parameters. So I'll just do a little table again for that. You can probably see this quite nicely by eye because our high water at Port Fraser is 4 meters. So it's essentially 3/4 of the way from 3.4 to 4.2. If we went 3/4 of the way from minus 0.2 to plus 0.2, it would be plus 0.1. But I'll just quickly do that on the whiteboard, so we can have a look at that. Okay, let's clear all that lot. Right, so let's put another little graph up. Oh, doing it in red this time. Okay. Not very good. Okay, so we had 4. Oh, no, we don't want that. Undo that. And undo that. So we had 4.2 over here, didn't we? On the left-hand side, we had 3.4. On this side, well, that breaks down quite nicely into 4 lots of 0.2. Let's do that. That gives us 4, 3.8, and 3.6. And the differences to apply were plus 0.2 down to minus 0.2, which again breaks down quite nicely into 4. So we can use the same gradations there on this occasion. So then that's it's plus 0.1, 0, and minus 0.1. And there we are. Our high water at Port Fraser was 4 meters, wasn't it? So that gives us plus 0.1, giving us 4.1 for our high water at Roswell Cove. Okay. Let's go back to our little table then. Okay. So working those through then, so there was our 2332 DST, so that's our high water time. We've just worked out our, what have I done? Plus 0.3 there. That should be plus 0.1, shouldn't it?
No.
What did I do there?
Below on the third line down, HW 4 plus 0.1 equals 4.1. That's what we've just done.
Yes, thank you. I seem to have written something else on the board, which isn't very helpful. Okay, so that should be 0.7 then, shouldn't it? Okay, so there's our times at Roswell Cove, times and heights adjusted. Also for the next day we need to do 1.3. Yep, so 1.3 we'll be needing. 0.9 is our first low water, and there's our 4.1 that we've just worked out, adding our 0.1. And there's our reference time to put in. Okay. So if we apply that to our table, so back to our standard port table, there it is. There's our Port Fraser table. So I've already put in some times there. There's our first low water, 0.9, and our high water that we've just worked out. Let's fill that in then. Let's give me a line. So from our 0.9 up to our 4.1, our time was 2012, wasn't it? So there's 2012. Okay, we need to go up. Our range on that day was from 0.6 to 4, so 3.4. So just looking on the top right-hand corner, we can see that roughly we're about 3/4 of the way from Neeps to Springs, so much closer to Springs. So I'm just going to go a smidgen above my spring line, which is the red one, and then reading across from there as per normal, intersect my line between my low and my high, and then read up, and that gives me a current height of tide of 2.2, not like that, it doesn't, of 2.2 at Roselle Cove. Okay, so our current height of tide is 2.2. Right, so how much now we need to work out, how much will the tide fall between now and the next low water, because this is going to inform what sort of depth we need to anchor in now to make sure we're okay. So the next question along is how much will the tide fall between now, 2012, when we've got 2.2, and the next low water. The next low water, just going back to our table, is 1.3, isn't it? So we're going to have a fall between the two, 2.2 down to 1.3, which is 0.9 meters. Okay, let's bring back our whiteboard.
Hey, Musto. Musto.
Say again? Okay, so I'm going to draw up a little table to help us work this out, because it's quite hard to get your head around it quite often. So I'm going to draw out a little diagram, come back, a little diagram which has our 2012 scenario, which is there, and our low water scenario here. So 2012, low water over here, a couple of boats. And we're going to work out what depth to anchor in now at 2012 to make sure that we're okay at our next low water. Anybody remember what our draft was?
1.7.
Good, 1.7. And what was the draft that she wanted? Sorry, what was the clearance she wanted? Excuse me. 1 meter. Okay. And the fall I just gave you between the two?
0.9.
0.9. Good. So that's from our 2.2 current height of tide down to our tomorrow 1.3. There's our 0.9. Okay, so what would the answer be then? The depth of water needed now to ensure that we have the clearance we want at the next low water. Anybody can give me that.
3.6.
Perfect. Who said that?
Martin.
Martin. Well done, Martin. Okay, so given that we're going to lose 0.9, if we anchor in 3.6 depth of water now, by the time we've dropped 0.9, we'll be in 2.7 depth of water, which is what we want. We've got a 1.7 meter keel, and we've got a 1 meter clearance, which is what we predetermined that we wanted. Perfect. Okay, let's have a look. What was our next question? So how much change should she put out? So that's the next thing we need to think about, because we're going to be there for the whole change of tide. So we've worked out that we need 3.6 currently, and that's based on a height of tide of 2.2, isn't it? What was our high water height of tide at Roselle Cove? What did we put into our curve?
4.1.
Say again, Gareth.
I think 4.1.
4.1, good. Okay, so what's the difference between our current height of tide and the high water height of tide?
5.
No, so we've got a current height of tide of 2.2. What's the high water height of tide?
1.9, isn't it?
It's
1.9.
1.9. Was that David? Yeah, 1.9.
Yep.
So 4.1 is our high water height, isn't it? Which is going to be shortly before midnight. And we've currently got 2.2. So if we anchor now in 3.6 meters depth of water, but we know we're going to face a rise of tide of 1.9 meters between now and then, what depth of water will we have? What will our maximum depth of water be?
5.5.
Perfect. Well done, David. 5.5. So we're now anchoring up in 3.6. We've got a rise of tide between now and then of 1.9. We'll be in 5.5. Maximum depth of water. Who can give me what length of chain we'd like to put out for that then, assuming all chain, no warp?
22 meters.
Perfect. So 22 meters, that's lovely. Yeah, so 4 times rule of thumb, 4 times if it's all chain and warp 6 times. So 22 meters should see us all right for our high water. 3.6 meters depth of water now will see us okay for our next low water. So we're nearly sorted. So there is that sorted out. So high water 4.1 minus our current 2.2 gives us the rise of tide of 1.9. Add that on to our current depth gives us 5.5 max depth. And whoever times that by 4 was perfect with 22. And then the next question, oops, that's not what we want. Come back. And then the next question is, once the hook is down, what else does she need to do? So anybody throw anything at me that we need to do? So we've got the hook down. We've done all our working out. That's good. Anything that you'd follow up with now?
Take some sightings.
Yep. So you'd like to make sure you're not dragging, wouldn't you? Is that Howard?
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd like to make sure you're not dragging. So what sort of things, when you say sightings, Howard?
Well, take some compass bearings from 3 points, so you know you can check you haven't moved.
Anything better than a 3-point fix? You could do a 3-point fix, certainly, and keep checking that, but it's quite a lot of work, I'd suggest. Can anybody suggest a slightly easier version of that?
Well, there is an app that you can, check on your GPS whether you're moving or not.
Yeah, so you can either set the anchor drag alarm on your plotter, or you could use this app, which is basically saying, yeah, we've moved X number of meters from our current position. And depending how much chain you put out, you'd set the radius of your chain as the radius of your swinging circle, and therefore anything outside that would alarm you. Anything more traditional than that? So a bit like Howard was saying was 3-point fix, but just making it a little bit less arduous than taking 3 bearings.
Transit.
Yeah, transit. Whoever said transit, perfect. So you can look ashore. You want to look at somewhere that's on the beam of the boat, don't you? So if you're going to slide, you're going to slide backwards initially, but once the tide's turned, it will be in the other direction. So something on the beam of your boat. It might be a couple of trees. It might be a rock on the beach and a line on the cliff. So anything, any 2 things in line. And if they shake out, then you've clearly moved. So okay, we're working out that we're. Sorry, go on.
Can I just check, when you say something on the beam of your boat, do you mean go to the beam of your boat and find a transit, or from your cockpit find something that is a transit, including the beam of your boat?
No, so let me just clear that. So if I can attempt to draw this. So let's say we're anchored up like that, Janet. There's our cable, there's our anchor, a little bit of a short cable there. And over here's the beach. So maybe there's a little hut on the beach. That would be quite handy. And somewhere behind that, there's a tree. And they are perfectly lined up if we look 90 degrees off our vessel. So when I talk about the beam of the boat, I mean if we're looking fore and aft, if we look 90 degrees from that position, because if we do drag at the moment, we're going to drag off in this direction, aren't we? So that transit would very quickly change.
Sorry, what I was meaning was, are you suggesting that you go up to the midpoint of your boat and find a transit?
Well, that's not critical. I mean, it depends how big your boat is, Janet. If you've got a massive boat, that could start to become critical. So you don't necessarily need to wander up there with your gin, but
okay.
Yeah. But what I meant was 90 degrees off the fore and aft line of your boat. So that might be right at the bow or the stern. That wouldn't matter. The same would apply, and that transit wouldn't change significantly unless it was a large craft. Okay. What else?
I'm not trying to pick holes here. It's just if this was a different technique, I was trying to find out whether I was missing a little trick.
No, not at all. I mean, you're right. There'll be a very small change, but not enough that we'd want to be that accurate about it.
Yeah.
You know, if the transit was a smidgen off, looking from your cockpit where you were sat there with your gin, you'd think that's fine. Okay, it's very slightly off, and I'll work with that.
Yeah.
Good. What else do we need to do? So we've made sure we're not dragging. We might check by grabbing the chain forward of the bow roller and just check that feels fairly solid. You generally get a sort of gravelly, vibratory sensation if your anchor is dragging. So if we're pretty sorted with all that, we're happy with our transit. We've set the anchor drag alarm on our app or our plotter, and we're happy with the chain, the feel of the chain. What else do we need to do? So we're going to be there overnight.
Fit a snubber.
Oh,
Anchor light.
ball.
Good, anchor ball and anchor light, both of those. They can be on
Yeah.
at the same time, can't they? It's 2012, so fairly soon it's going to start getting dusk. So yeah, we'd get our anchor ball up and stick our light on, make sure we're legal. Therefore, if anybody crashes into us, they can't say, well, we thought they were motoring. And then we should be pretty good to go. We might, as we said earlier, not necessarily do an anchor watch if we're happy with the nature of the seabed, etc., and we're fairly sheltered, but we might, somebody said about the change of the tide, that we need to think about that, and that would be a typical point where you might drag your anchor, wouldn't it? That it needs to reset itself on the change of the tide. So we might just pop our head above deck for 10 minutes on the change of the tide and check that she resets herself. Good, so that's pretty much our problem dealt with. Does anybody have any questions, any of those bits that I've gone through that don't make sense or anything else surrounding it?
Yeah, what's the app that was mentioned, please?
I wish I knew. I'll have to refer that back to whoever mentioned it.
It's called Anchor Watch.
Anchor Watch.
Yeah.
Could have guessed, couldn't I, really? Thanks.
It's not that great, though. It's all right, but it's not brilliant.
Okay.
But David, sorry,
you have to set a wider sort of drag or a greater drag distance than you actually think you will need, which is quite surprising. Otherwise, it's going off every minute.
Oh, right. Yep.
So it takes a bit of getting used to.
Sure. Okay. Still worth knowing. Thanks.
But most plotters, David, or every single plotter will have an anchor drag alarm, including very basic GPSs. So yeah, right. You should be covered as long as you've got one of those on board.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Anything else?
Nope.
No? Nope. Good. In which case, I think we're fairly good to wrap up. I know Laura's continuing a social after this, so I said I'd make sure it's done within 40 minutes. So I think we're okay on that. I'll mess about and see if I can upload this to YouTube. No promises, but we'll see if we can do that. In which case, should you really want to watch all this again, you're able to do so. Well, nice to talk to you all, and yeah, I hope to see you in the club before too long.
Thank you.
Thank
That was
you
brilliant.
Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Tom.
Very much.
Very good. Great.
All the best, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.